So Diddy, after the Cassie lawsuit, gets hit with a bunch of lawsuits, and then ultimately the raids, and then this criminal case.
Let's talk about the filth that's starting to come out in the early days of the Diddy trial. This, of course, is P. Diddy. Surprise, surprise, he's a creep. Surprise, surprise, he's done horrible things.
The courtroom was electric. Day 2 of Sean Diddy Combs' trial wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle. A masterclass in unraveling the tightly wound threads of power, manipulation, and control. And at the center of it all was Cassandra Cassie Ventura. Pregnant, poised, and visibly grappling with the weight of her own words. Her testimony sliced through the courtroom like a scalpel.
The question is he a criminal? Is he basically akin to a mob boss running several criminal enterprises? And while it's very clear to me he is a depraved, disgusting person, we have to prove that he violated the law.
When she walked in, you could feel the collective breath of the room hitch. Here she was, the woman who had spent over a decade in the shadow of one of the most influential figures in music and business, now standing tall and recounting a nightmare so surreal it could have been scripted. But this wasn't fiction. This was her life. A life that, as she described, was meticulously choreographed by Diddy himself.
The feds, Al Capone style, have not charged everything under the sun. They've charged 3 main charges: racketeering, trafficking, and the transport of a And I'll tell you, I don't know about the racketeering charge. It's pretty sweeping. And I'll tell you what the general
Cassie didn't mince words. She dove straight into the heart of the allegations, laying bare details that could make even the most hardened courtroom observer flinch. She described her introduction to what Diddy allegedly called freak-offs, a term as bizarre as the acts it represented. According to her, these weren't spontaneous moments of intimacy, but orchestrated events, complete with lighting setups and wardrobe instructions. And Diddy, he wasn't just a participant, he was the director. The puppet master pulling every string, from the choice of outfits to the carefully curated ambiance, he controlled it all.
That they will be adding 2 defense attorneys. We only thought initially it was 1, but one thing that stood out to me when Mark Agnifilo was talking about this was he said that these defense attorneys are in the courtroom right now. I didn't see Mark Garagos in that courtroom, but what I did see is 2 defense attorneys that have been there when Brian Steele came on board, and those 2 defense attorneys were Nicole Westmoreland.
The level of detail Cassie provided was chilling. She spoke about being sent to shop for certain items, outfits that she knew would later play a role in scenarios she didn't fully understand or want to. The jury heard about how Diddy would allegedly dictate her every move, from what she wore to how she interacted with others. And then there was the lighting. It started with candles, romantic, one might think, but quickly escalated to studio-grade. It wasn't about intimacy, it was about production, a spectacle, a show. And Cassie, she was the lead actress, whether she wanted the role or not.
Because we now know who all the prosecutors will be on Diddy's trial. They're all women. They have assembled a team of female prosecutors, and that is definitely not by accident.
But what truly sent a ripple through the courtroom was her admission of fear, crippling, paralyzing fear. She said it was this fear that kept her compliant. Fear that he would release private recordings she didn't consent to. Fear that he would retaliate in ways she couldn't predict. Fear, ultimately, of the man she once loved. And as she spoke, rubbing her pregnant belly as if to anchor herself, it became clear to everyone in the room. This was a woman who had endured more than most could fathom.
The judge is hopeful that could be concluded as soon as Wednesday, with opening statements in the case beginning next week and then the beginning of the evidence. So Combs has pleaded not guilty. He has said, his lawyers have said, that all of these allegations are the prosecutors trying to criminalize his sexual activity that they say was entirely consensual.
Diddy's reaction was telling. He sat rigid, his eyes darting between Cassie and his legal team. He fidgeted with a pen, scribbled notes, and leaned back in his chair as if to create physical distance from her words. But there was no escaping them. Each syllable landed like a hammer, and while he avoided eye contact with Cassie, the tension between them was palpable. For someone who had built an empire on charisma and control, he suddenly seemed small, out of place, and exposed. The prosecution wasted no time capitalizing on the gravity of Cassie's testimony. They painted a picture of a man who allegedly used his wealth, status, and influence not just to charm but to dominate. They argued that Diddy didn't just want control, he demanded it. They introduced text messages, pieces of digital evidence that, while mundane on the surface, carried an undercurrent of coercion. Messages where Cassie allegedly asked him which pill to take before one of these infamous events. Messages where he allegedly dictated her actions down to the smallest detail. It was control on a molecular level.
Which, again, the judge kind of made this a point, too, talking about, okay, well, if we're going to continue to do sidebars each and every single time that a prospective juror has to talk about a sensitive topic, that could take up a lot of time. But again, the defense and the government both seem pretty confident that they'll still be able to kind of get it going at a quick pace. This isn't unusual to do in these types of high-profile cases. So that was pretty much just the topics about,
And then there was the video. The infamous 2016 footage of Diddy attacking Cassie in a hotel hallway. It wasn't just a piece of evidence, it was a visual punch to the gut. While the defense tried to frame it as a moment of domestic conflict, the prosecution argued it was a window into a pattern of behavior. In the footage, Diddy's aggression was undeniable. The way he dragged her, the way he lashed out. It was all there, raw and unfiltered. And as the jury watched, their expressions ranged from shock to discomfort. This wasn't just a case anymore, it was a reckoning.
Those individuals allegedly included high-ranking supervisors in the business, personal assistants, security staff, and household staff.
But Cassie's testimony wasn't just about what happened behind closed doors. It was about the ripple effects. She detailed how her self-worth eroded over time, how she began to see herself through his eyes, a pawn, a tool, something to be used and discarded. She admitted that, for a time, she even believed she enjoyed these orchestrated events because they gave her a fleeting sense of closeness to Diddy. I thought maybe if I did what he wanted, he would love me more, she said, her voice steady but laced with pain. It was a haunting statement, one that lingered in the air long after she said it. And then there was the mention of Kim Porter. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably at the mere mention of her name. Porter, Diddy's former partner and the mother of several of his children, had passed away under circumstances that many still find suspicious. Cassie's testimony didn't delve deeply into Porter's demise, but the mere connection between the two women was enough to raise eyebrows. Both had been close to Diddy, and both, it seemed, had stories of fear and control. The prosecution hinted at parallels, drawing a line between Cassie's allegations and the whispers that have surrounded Porter's untimely passing. It was a subtle move, but an effective one.
They saw evidence in the case. They immediately honed in on racketeering, and they started saying, why is this racketeering with one guy? And they're charging this one guy. They had a real problem with that. They did not have a problem with the Mann Act. They found him guilty on the Mann Act. And they hung 6 to 6 on racketeering.
As the day wore on, the courtroom became a theater of tension. The defense, for its part, tried to poke holes in Cassie's narrative. They questioned her credibility, her motives, and even her emotions. They suggested she was embellishing, that she was framing consensual moments as something sinister. But Cassie didn't waver. Her responses were measured, her demeanor composed. If she was rattled, she didn't show it. What became clear, however, was that this case wasn't just about Cassie. It was about an alleged pattern of behavior that spanned decades. It was about power dynamics, about the ways in which wealth and influence can shield someone from accountability. And as the prosecution hinted at other witnesses, other women with stories eerily similar to Cassie's, the room seemed to collectively brace itself. This wasn't just a trial, it was an unmasking.
A U.S. judge has ruled that the rapper and producer Sean Diddy Combs will stand trial on federal trafficking and racketeering charges in May. He'll be held in prison until then. Sean Combs has pleaded not guilty to charges that he used his business empire to transport women and male workers across state lines to take part in recorded performances. If convicted, he could face a life sentence.
By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was heavy. Cassie's testimony had set the stage, but it was clear there was more to come. The prosecution had promised a parade of evidence, from text messages to financial records to more video footage. And while the defense was gearing up to counter these claims, the weight of the allegations was impossible to ignore. What unfolded that day wasn't just a legal battle, it was a clash of narratives. On one side, a woman reclaiming her voice after years of silence. On the other, a man whose empire and legacy hung in the balance. And as the courtroom emptied, one question lingered. How deep does this story go?
Hey, real quickly, all that commissary stuff, he's not getting any of that because people in the SHU have an abbreviated list. So he's out of luck. No stake for him. Yeah, he is on watch. This guy thought he would have went home. all of a sudden he didn't get bond. Remember, the first night that he was there.
And just when you thought the courtroom revelations couldn't get any darker, any more jaw-dropping, the prosecution began threading together a story so intricate, so unnervingly calculated, that it made Cassie's testimony feel like just the tip of a much larger iceberg. The legal implications of what was unfolding weren't just staggering. They were the kind that could redefine how we think about power, control, and justice in the world of celebrity empires. This wasn't just about Diddy and his alleged actions anymore. It was a mirror held up to an entire industry that thrives on silence and shadows. Let's start with the prosecution's strategy, which became clearer as the day unfolded. They weren't just aiming to prove a pattern, they wanted to dismantle the facade. Piece by piece, they began to deconstruct the machinery of Diddy's empire, painting it not as a business juggernaut, but as a network designed to enable and conceal. They introduced evidence suggesting that key members of his entourage weren't just employees, they were enablers, complicit in maintaining what the prosecution described as an ecosystem of fear. Assistants, security personnel, even business associates all allegedly played roles in ensuring that no one stepped out of line and that Diddy's control remained absolute.
This is very significant, just from who we associate Diddy being and everything we've seen him do over the decades. Like you said, this is quite the downfall to go from, we saw the mansions back in March that were raided by the feds. So to go from living in those mansions to being in a jail cell right now, I think it really underscores the magnitude of what he's facing and the weight of the federal government.
Witnesses were named, though not all present. Some were high profile enough to make the courtroom buzz with whispers. People who had once been seen as untouchable, now potentially facing subpoenas. Others were the kind of behind-the-scenes figures who, until now, had remained invisible. A former security guard's name came up, someone who allegedly acted as a gatekeeper, ensuring that Diddy's rules were followed to the letter. There were quiet nods to financial transactions that could suggest hush money, payments routed through shell companies, or disguised as consulting fees. The prosecution hinted that these payouts weren't just about keeping people quiet, they were about keeping the machinery running. It was transactional silence, plain and simple. Then there were the recordings. The jury didn't hear them, not yet, but the prosecution alluded to their existence in a way that sent ripples through the room. They claimed to possess audio files, allegedly recovered from old phones and hard drives, where Diddy's voice could be heard giving instructions, directives that, if authenticated, could prove damning. The very idea of hearing his voice, detached from the polished public persona, was enough to make people shift uncomfortably in their seats. And the recordings weren't just of conversations, the prosecution suggested. Some allegedly documented planning, like logistics for events that were far from business meetings. If these recordings are played in court, the fallout could be seismic.
Unfortunately, we're all going to take a disgusting trip to his seedy, awful world. The man has no class. He has no kindness in his dark, dark heart. And he's depraved. That's my opinion. This is a depraved, disgusting individual about whom I wish to hear nothing after this trial is done.
But the defense wasn't sitting idle. They were quick to pivot, attempting to dismantle the credibility of anyone who dared to corroborate Cassie's claims. They leaned heavily on the idea that these witnesses, many of whom had been in Diddy's orbit for years, had agendas, motives, financial or otherwise, that made their testimony suspect. One particularly sharp exchange involved a former executive assistant who had allegedly witnessed troubling behavior firsthand. The defense zeroed in on her departure from Diddy's company, painting it as a bitter fallout over money rather than a moral awakening. "Isn't it true," they asked her, "that you only came forward after being denied a severance package?" It was a moment designed to cast doubt, but the assistant pushed back, her voice trembling yet firm.
It's a question of that, but when you read through the indictment, it's pretty clear who could be indicted as a co-conspirator. Right now, there are people in the indictment who would be considered unnamed co-conspirators, but clearly have played a role in this conspiracy. And I think prosecutors have some big leverage on them because they're hoping that they testify against Diddy as prosecution witnesses.
And then the prosecution dropped another bombshell, the introduction of financial records that seemed to corroborate some of the claims. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were receipts for luxury accommodations, private jets, and international travel, all tied to names that had surfaced in the allegations. The prosecutors argued that these weren't random expenses. They were part of a calculated effort to facilitate what they described as a system of exploitation. The defense, of course, tried to spin it. This is the lifestyle of the rich and famous, they argued. You're looking at business expenses, not evidence of misconduct. But the narrative was becoming harder to dismiss. The sheer volume of documentation was overwhelming.
That he has, with others, and just because no one else has been charged, which normally in a RICO case, you would have others charged. It was a statute designed to get mob bosses, trying to get at criminal behavior that's like a web of criminal behavior that you can't necessarily prove, like the one thing or the statute of limitations expired on the other thing, but you're just showing this bad guy who's operating what's clearly an enterprise that over and over engages in criminal problems.
But here's where things took an even darker turn. The prosecution revealed a set of internal emails allegedly sent between Diddy's travel coordinators and personal assistants. The emails outlined specific instructions for arranging private entertainment at international destinations, complete with coded language that prosecutors argued was meant to obscure the true nature of the activities. What made these emails so damning wasn't just their content, but the tone, the casual, business-as-usual manner in which they discussed logistics. It painted a picture of a well-oiled machine, one that had allegedly been operating for years, if not decades. And the timestamps? They aligned almost perfectly with some of the dates Cassie had already mentioned in her testimony. Coincidence? The prosecution didn't think so. And if that wasn't enough, there were the flight manifests. These weren't just documents listing passenger names, they were a roadmap of who was where and when. The prosecutors highlighted a series of trips spanning from Miami to Ibiza, Paris to Las Vegas, with overlapping names appearing repeatedly. Some of these names belonged to people who had already been mentioned in court, while others were still unidentified. The prosecution argued that these manifests could link Diddy to a broader network of individuals who either participated in or facilitated the alleged activities. The defense, predictably, dismissed this as speculation, but the weight of the evidence was beginning to accumulate. The jury was left to wonder how many people knew and how many were complicit.
You know, I suppose it could be coincidence. I don't think it's coincidence, and especially given the nature of the case.
Yes.
Because when you look at who is examining these various witnesses, especially female alleged victims, of which there will be 4.
And while all of this was unfolding, there was the specter of the missing witness, the so-called Victim 3. The prosecution admitted they were struggling to locate her, a revelation that the defense jumped on immediately. They argued that her absence undermined the case, that if this key witness was unwilling to testify, it spoke volumes about the credibility of the allegations. But the prosecution countered with a chilling suggestion that her absence might not be voluntary. They hinted at the possibility of intimidation, though they stopped short of making any direct accusations. The room tensed at the implication. After all, this was a trial already steeped in allegations of coercion and control. The idea that someone might be too frightened to come forward wasn't hard to believe. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the fallout was spreading like wildfire. Social media was ablaze with commentary, theories, and outrage. Fans and critics alike were dissecting every new revelation, every whispered rumor. And the ripple effects weren't limited to public opinion. Industry insiders were reportedly scrambling, with some distancing themselves from Diddy and others remaining conspicuously silent. Brands that had once proudly aligned themselves with his name were said to be in crisis mode, assessing the potential damage. And then there were the rumors, unverified of course, that certain executives and artists were being quietly questioned by federal investigators. The walls weren't just closing in on Diddy, they were closing in on an entire network.
But there's also strategic reasons for the prosecutors to want him to have co-defendant, because right now he hasn't waived his right to a speedy trial, which would force prosecutors to take him to trial pretty quick, which they actually might not be ready to do. But if they supersede him and have co-defendants with him, it makes it a lot easier to pursue a trial continuance without him waiving his speedy trial right.
The implications of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. This wasn't just about one man's alleged misconduct. It was about an industry that had, for years, turned a blind eye to troubling behavior. It was about the systems of power that allow people to act with impunity, knowing that their wealth and influence can buy silence. and it was about the people who had been complicit, whether actively or passively, in enabling that behavior. The trial was forcing a reckoning not just for Diddy but for everyone who had stood by, who had looked the other way, who had chosen self-preservation over accountability. And yet, for all the revelations, for all the mounting evidence, the case was far from a slam dunk. The defense was relentless, poking holes wherever they could, exploiting every inconsistency, every gap in the narrative. They knew that all it took was reasonable doubt, and in a case this complex, with so many moving parts, doubt was a weapon they wielded expertly. But with each passing day, the prosecution seemed to gain ground, their case becoming more cohesive, more compelling. By the end of the session, the room was heavy with anticipation. The prosecution had hinted at more to come, more witnesses, more evidence, more revelations. But what would that mean for Diddy? For the people around him? For an industry that was watching, knowing that it could be next? The questions were endless, the stakes immeasurable.
And what's really going to be interesting is the parade of celebrities who we expect to be mentioned and or called into that courtroom. You know, people who we hadn't heard about prior, like Mike Myers, you know, Austin Powers, Mike Myers. Why is he getting called? Why is he on the witness list? That'll be fascinating. And then, of course, there are the no-name, quote unquote, women who are going to have to find every ounce of courage they have.
So now I want to hear from you. Is this the beginning of the end for one of the most powerful figures in music? Or will his empire find a way to weather the storm? And what about the industry itself? How deep does the rock go? And who will fall next? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next one.